everybody, it's Claire here from Sewn by Claire, and today I am recording the finishing video for the fabric advent calendar panel that we've been making. Now, if this is the first video that you're jumping onto, you might want to have a look back at videos 1, 2 and 3, because those are the parts that we talk about quilting the panel, preparing the pockets and attaching the pockets. And then there's a bonus video that I recorded, which was the non-sugar treats that I've put into my advent calendar for my granddaughter Clementine for when she's older. So hopefully that's given you some ideas as to what you might want to put into your calendar as well. However, if you've already got to that stage and you just want some tips on finishing, you're in the right place. And we're going to get our calendar sorted out now so that we can get it gifted and in the post if we need to, or it's just ready in good time, ready for start of December the 1st, which is when we'll start using it. So I've got my panel here, looking quite big. We've got the pockets attached. Oops, got my fingers in. Got the pockets attached here, so that's all ready now. So we've quilted it on the back, and that's all ready to go. So the next step now is to neaten up these edges, because obviously we've got the backing and the wadding that's overhanging the actual frame of the piece. And then I've also purchased some backing fabric, which my friend Alison has kindly brought over for me from the UK, and that's the backing fabric that I'm going to use for mine. I think those colours match really well. So we're going to start by evening up the calendar first, so we'll get onto that, and then I'll talk to you about the different things we need to think about as we're going forward, because regardless of whether you put in a backing on your calendar or whether you are just leaving it with the quilting showing like that, or whether you want to be hanging it or laying it or however you want to display it, then the first thing we need to do is to get it squared up. So that's the bit that we're going to do next. So what I've got here is I have actually got a table protector on. This is my kitchen island actually that I'm using, and I've got one of those foam-backed table protectors, which is they're really good and really robust. So I do like using that on top of my kitchen island, and my kitchen island actually makes a really good cutting mat for when I'm cutting out for my dressmaking projects too. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look and square this up. So if we lay it down, we can see that some of the sides are a little bit wavy, and we're just going to try and even those off as much as we can. I think that with mine, I've got this inner border and the outer border. So first off, I'm going to cut it around about this 1/4 of an inch in from this white border here, and hopefully that's slightly more stable for me to use. So in order to do that, I'm going to use my quilting ruler that I've got. It's a nice long ruler. If you've not got a nice long ruler like this, you could use the edge of a chopping board as well. And if you don't have a rotary cutter, don't worry, don't rush out and buy one. You could use a pen, perhaps a Frixion pen that's heat erasable, just to mark a line, and then you can cut it with scissors. So don't think you've got to go out and buy lots of new equipment, because that really isn't the case. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to use my ruler, and what we do is we put the ruler across the work. I keep twisting this round, don't I? Hold on 1 second. I'm thinking as I'm doing, so bear with me. Is we always want to protect our work with the ruler. If we put the ruler over this side and we cut, then the chance is that we could go into our panel, and we don't want to do that. We want to protect the panel as much as we can. So I'm actually going to put my ruler over the top of the panel, and I'm going to line up 1/4 of an inch in from the 2 corners here. Now we can just pull this slightly and get it as straight as we can with the line, just underneath, backwards and forwards. Just use our fingers to try and get it as straight as we can. And I'm using that red line. Just choose a reference point on your quilt, and then hopefully you can do the same as me. And then once I'm ready to do that, I'm going to arch my fingers. I'm going to start just off the edge, and then I'm going to remove. Quite a lot of pressure needed. That first edge, and already we can see that that's starting to neaten up and look really smart. It's strange how at each stage of the quilting process that we actually do, it all starts to come together, each little bit that we do. So again, we're going to do the same here. And I've got quite a big bow on mine, but that's quite normal when you're quilting. That's why you always have to leave extra on the edges. You know, when we said did the quilting about the backing, I said to you to always leave a little bit extra, about an inch extra either side. So it might be that I need to do this in stages. That's like 1/4 of an inch. Make sure I'm getting my reference point correct. I'm going to do this in stages because mine's trying to go off centre. So let's do a little bit first. Make sure I'm recording. Yes, I am. Because I can only do this once, I haven't got a spare panel in the background to use. Okay, let's do the next few inches. Put some pressure on. And the next few inches, just getting, because we've got lines on this, if this was all the same fabric colour, so if yours has got a nice wide border and it's all the same colour, you might not need to pull and push yours like I'm doing with mine. But I don't want you to be daunted if it's not quite straight. That's all we need to do. It's just keeping that lovely 1/4 of an inch just around the top of that edge there. Okay, so cover my rotary blade up again. Always need to think safety first. And then we're going to do this side panel again, this side one again. And I think I'll do it in stages again to try and make sure. The fabric does stretch and pull a little bit, so you've not got to worry too much. You can straighten it up. So just pull it out so it's underneath the blade, underneath the ruler, and then we'll cut a piece just until it starts to go off, and then we can then just pull it a little bit more to get it straight again. Pressure on. A little bit more. And when I do the other side, I'm going to change the camera angle so that you can see a little bit more of what I'm doing. Just bear with me for this bit. Just taking our time though, making sure it's as we want it to be. We put all this work into our quilt, we don't want to now go and spoil it. So again, nearly finished on this side. There we go. So here we go, we've got a nice neat panel, looking all lovely, and I'm quite happy with that now. And we've got not that much wastage at all really, so only a few scraps just to use. You can save these for smaller projects if you want to on the edge. I know that batting's really expensive, but it's up to you as to what you're going to use it for. We're not going to use any more of those pieces just now. The next thing that we then are going to have a look at is how our quilt fits onto our backing fabric. So I've got my backing fabric here, it does need an iron, but for now it'll just give us some idea of what we're working towards, because the first thing that I want to cut out is the backing fabric, the actual panel for the backing itself. Now you may have chosen that you're not doing that bit, and that's up to you. But for me, I wanted this decorative backing on the back of my quilt to hide all of my quilting stitches. If yours is nice and neat, or your quilting thread's the same colour as your panel, then you don't need to worry too much. So we can see that I've got a metre of fabric here, and I'm using just over 1/4 of it here. So we've got the end, if I bring it across here, you'll be able to see where the end is, just working out where my camera angles are. Okay, so just got a bit extra here, and we've got a bit extra over the side here, and that's good, because when we're talking about this, the next stage that we're going to do after we've cut this panel out, and I am going to cut it out slightly bigger, and then I'm going to stitch it on, because just in case it moves slightly, so I'll probably do about 1/2 inch extra along all of the edges, and then I'll trim it up again after we've added the panel. I'm going to give it an iron, and if I've got some spray starch, which I've got, I'm also going to spray starch it as well, so that it's nice and stiff to try and keep out any wrinkles and crinkles in it. The next thing that we need to think about as well, after we've cut this out and attached it is we need to make sure we've got enough fabric for the rest of it, because the other things that we need to do are we are going to be putting 2 doweling strips at the top and the bottom. We're also going to have to get the binding out of this, which is the bit that hides the edges, and I like a separate binding on mine, so I'll be doing that. You can actually use this as a self-binding on the backing and just fold it in twice if you wanted to, but I'm gonna do it the long way. You know me, I like to do things properly. Properly in inverted commas, I suppose, really, because it's personal preference. So we want to get the backing sorted out on this. We also need the binding, which is just, I shall use 2.5 inch strips for that, like I do a normal quilt. And then the other thing that we want to be doing is making the sleeves for the doweling rods to go into. And I also want to have some sort of hanging loop at the top here. Now for me, I do 2 separate strands, almost like ties on the back of a little girl's dress, where you have tie it in a bow, because I want to be able to undo the bow and then put it through a door handle and then tie it back up again if it's a door handle that's a flat one. Because sometimes people don't always have places where they can loop it over, and so if there is the ability for the ties to come apart and tie into a bow, then I think that's a really useful thing to do, because they can just loop it over if they can, but if they've got to tie it through something, then you can undo the bow, as I say, and do that. So next, I'm happy that this is just 1 metre of fabric that I purchased, and it's more than enough. I'll have some left to go into my scrap bag and my stash afterwards. But at the moment, we're confident that's going to fit. I'm confident I've got enough with the spare to do the things that we need to do. So let me get on. I'll go and iron this fabric, and I'm going to spray starch it as well so that it's slightly stiffer. And you can get that from your local supermarket in the laundry section. It'll just give it a little bit of body so that it won't crinkle underneath, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the different bits that we're going to do. Okay, so I'm back again after ironing duties, and I've just placed my quilted top, the panel, on top of the fabric. I've got the right side down onto my cutting mat. Just for now, it doesn't really, I think that's the best way, because you want it to be fitting and cut out the way that it's going to be on your panel, just in case there is any slight twisting on it when you were sewing it and quilting it, because the quilting does tend to pull it in. I can see here across this panel here, where the heaviest of the quilting is, that it's actually pulled it in a little bit narrower on this far side. So I just need to bear that in mind when I am cutting my panel. So I've got it spaced with approximately 1/2 inch around, all the way around on my quilt, and I'm just smoothing it down to make sure that that's all nice and flat. The other thing that I've done is I've just changed the orientation round, because I wanted to make sure I've got some nice long strips. So the length of the panel, the length of my backing fabric at 1 metre is less than the width of my panel when it's cut, because the width of this fabric is about 115 centimetres. So we wanted to make sure that this was going to be, I've got the longest strips possible for when I'm doing my binding, because that means minimal joins. So what we're going to do now is just go back to the quilting ruler. I think these 2 sides on that you can't see on camera are fine, because I've just outlined those up with the edge of the fabric and the edge of the panel, if you can see there. So I've got a bit spare here and a bit spare there. So I'm just going to mirror that now. So making sure I've got my cutting board underneath my panel here. So I'm not going to be damaging any table or work surfaces. And then I'm just going to cut a generous inch. I did say 1/2 inch, didn't I? But I don't like wasting fabric. So you've got to cut enough that you're comfortable with, that you're not going to be, I could have cut less with that, because fabric's expensive. But because mine's got a little bit of a twist on it, I'm just going to do 1 inch. So again, I'm just going to cut through this fabric and move my panel down towards me. Again, you can just mark this out with a pen and with scissors. You don't have to have a quilting ruler. It's just that I have, because I do some quilting as well. And up to this corner, about 1 inch past. And we're always trying to cut safely, aren't we? So we're going to twist this round now and smooth it out. Make sure that nothing's shifted. Oh, I need to twist it the other way, don't I? Because again, what we want to do is we want to protect our panel with our ruler. And as I've just twisted this now, it's counterintuitive because I actually want to be able to cut with my right hand, not my left hand. Obviously, if you're left-handed, you do it to suit you. Let me twist this around the other way. Just shows you that we just have to just stop and just think things through before we do anything. So I'm going to fold that over there so it can fit on my cutting mat nicely. Make sure this fabric here is all nice and straight. And then quilting ruler again, as I say, just using an inch around mine. And then take that off. So as you can see, we've taken the section out now of our backing fabric out of here. I'm just going to pop that to one side, try not to crease it too much because it has been ironed and starched. It's really pretty fabric actually. I was surprised it matched so well. It's difficult to tell when you're buying online, isn't it, sometimes? So I just wanted to talk to you as well before we start to actually tack this in place ready for sewing it down, because it's very common for people to actually put labels onto their quilts. And what I want to do is, because I want this quilt, this advent calendar panel to last for a long time, I just want to sort of mark the fact that it's made by me and who it was made for and the year. And that's quite a nice thing to do, be able to do. So we need to think about that before we actually start tacking our backing onto our quilt, because I actually want it to sit on the back here, and we can try and sew it on afterwards after we've sewn it onto our quilt, but actually that just makes things a little bit more difficult for us. So what I'm going to do is I have actually made, for those of you who've seen my extra bonus video on the non-sugar treats that I've made, so I've made this little plaque here that's going to go on the side. I've just got to drill it in the four corners, and then I'm going to sew that onto the back. So I'm going to line it up here along one of these pockets here, but on the back, and then I'm going to just sew it onto my panel. Now that I probably will do afterwards because I can pull it away, and I'm going to sew it on the back there, probably in the centre somewhere, just so that there's a memento. And I've just put for Clementine, love Grandma 2022, just so that she knows it was for her and it was made especially for her and the year that I made it as well. It's always nice just to do that. But if you wanted to, you can get printed ones. If you've got a, I've used my ink stamp to stamp that, which you could do onto fabric if you wanted to. You could also do a print out on a computer and print it out, and then if you've got your fabric, I usually use like a patch of fabric, so perhaps a tone-on-tone pale colour, you could then put it over the top of the printed out wording that you want to use and trace through over your letters and then embroider it. That's another thing that you could do. Or you could use a permanent marker pen, you know, one of those little fine line ones, and write over it if you wanted to. That would also be nice. Or if you've got an embroidery machine that does letters, or your sewing machine does letters, you could sew out a label for that. But this is the point at which you need to think about that, because if you want to sew it on neatly with your machine, you're going to need to do that before we actually put the backing onto the quilt, because once this is on, you're not going to be able to separate the two to be able to sew that on. I hope that all makes sense, and hopefully it's just a little thought that you might want to do. So the next thing that I'm going to do now is just going to grab some pins, because I want to smooth this out, and I'm actually going to run a tacking stitch by hand around this red edge here, just to hold my backing onto my quilt in place before I start doing anything else. And this backing is the first thing that we're going to put on. We're going to do some other stages first before we sew it on by machine, but just for now I'm just going to tack that on my hand. So let me just go and get my thread ready, and we'll get on with that. So with my panel nice and neat, I've got a little stray thread just there. Let me just take that one off. Okay, so with the panel all nice and neat and flat, and I've smoothed that out, give it a little pull in places just to make sure that you're happy that it's staying nice and straight, but as I say, the start should help with that. I'm just going to pin I am using just ordinary dressmaking pins for this. You can use safety pins if you wanted to as well, so you don't stab yourself when you are sewing it. But I'm just straightening this off a little bit if I can, just as I'm kind of sewing it, pinning it in place, and just using the straight edges of the cut backing that I've used just to make that right where I can. So trying to keep that really straight and flat where we can do. Okay, let's just twist this round so we can work on it. And again, this side's not too bad, a little bit wavy. I think that's all part of the handmade nature of what we're making. And if we try and stretch it too much, we are going to distort it, so we just need to try and do what we can. And I think it's going to get distorted a little bit in use as well, so but we'll try our best. So I'm going to do it on the other side as well. Just give it a little pull, just make sure those those threads are lying nice and flat, no creases if we can. And again then up this side here. The problem is, the reason why I'm pinning it like this rather than tacking it on my machine is that I don't want to, if we start to move it and pull it round on the machine, we can get creases underneath it, and I'm trying to get this backing as neat as I can. And I think just tacking it and just taking that time is just going to help it as well when we work on the next stages of what we're going to do, because we're actually going to work on the hanging pocket first for the doweling rod first, before then we work on the binding. So that's going to be the order that we do things. Okay, so that's all laying there, all nice and flat. Let's have a look on the back here. And what I'm going to do is just run my hands over it and just see where there might, so at that top end it still needs a bit of work. It's just, as I'm smoothing it, can you see it's just starting to crease a little bit, so I'll just take a little bit of that excess out there. Otherwise it's not too bad, a little bit at the bottom here, so let me just move that pin there. This is the difficult bit when you're trying to do this on a bigger quilt, because you're trying to keep it nice and flat. That one is changing too, just a second. And normally if you just take the pin out and then just release that fabric, it does just sit down nicely for you. So again here we've got some white scabbing, so I'm taking the pin out, just smoothing it again, holding on to that edge, pinning it with my finger and thumb, and then just popping the pin back in again. It's just helping it just sit a little bit nicer and flatter. Obviously this can be one of those never-ending jobs to do, so you have to reach a point where you're relatively happy with it as well, in the scheme of things. Okay, one more here I think, and then we're done. Otherwise you'll be here all day watching me smooth this down, but you'll see, when you do yours you'll see what I mean. Okay, I'm happy with that. So I'm going to turn that back over again now. I'm just starting at one edge. I've just got a needle and thread, and I am just going to tack it in the red, because that will be covered by the binding. And I'm just trying to, it's just big stitches, just going to hold it in place. Oops, caught my pin cushion. And that's just going to help us when we, so I'm just lifting it up with my fingers slightly so I can get underneath it, but trying not to distort that backing at all. You can see the size of the stitches that I'm doing just there, look, nice and big. And so it's just going to hold it in place. And I'm doing it in the red. We can take these stitches out when we sew the binding on, but for now it'll just keep that in place. So let me just get on and do that, and then we will work on the next stage. Oh, and just remember that if you wanted to do your label, you need to do it before you tack all the way round. You could tack 3/4 if you wanted to, or down to say here, and then just leave that bit loose, because then you've got the rest of the placement ready, and then sew it on if you wanted to in your quilt label. But mine, because I'm going to be going through the wooden block, then I should be able to sew that on fairly easily by hand once we've finished. So I'm just going to finish at each corner just by doing a double stitch. And just take my threads off. Once I finish one area, I'm just going to take my pins out. And then we can still make sure that this is lying flat once we've finished. Oh, we've got a bit of a pucker there on the front. It's just a constant, not a constant, but a continuous kind of just checking and making sure that we're as happy as we can be with it. Okay, let's thread this now. The other thing that you'll notice is that I'm working on the two long sides first before the bottom, because we can always just pull that slightly down if we need to. So we'll work on the next long side. So I'm actually going to sew this way as well, so that I'm always sewing down towards the bottom. So I'll just take it off the edge of my work surface while I just stitch this down. Out before I finish this bottom edge. I'm just going to just smooth it all down, make sure that any excess that's been generated, that there's no creases at all running out to any of the corners. It does help the fibres just bind together as well a little bit. I think we said that when I was doing the backing on with the wadding, wasn't I, that sometimes just smoothing your hands over it does just help smooth it all down. And I'm going to say to you as well that you might have to, if you're a bit of a perfectionist, you're going to have to leave some of that to one side whilst you are squaring up this quilt, because if yours is like mine where we've got this very decorative border, we can't, even up here, we can't keep taking it off and off trying to make it square, because it's just going to keep shrinking. And it's actually the stitching on the quilting that's pulled it in just here. And there's nothing we can really do about that, especially on these panels where there's no sort of margin for squaring it up, because there's lines all the way around the panel in all directions. So wherever you try and square it up to is going to send your eye off. So I go for the best I can get, that I'm as happy as possible with, without making my life a misery, or berating myself more importantly as well, because the nature of stitching is that this is what happens, obviously over a bigger area, and if we were quilting the whole quilt the same way as we have done here, then it would have shrunk similarly. So because we've got a lot of quilting in the section here, hardly any in the black up here, and then we've just got the stitching of the pockets down here, there's varying degrees of quilting on this panel itself. So that has played a part in how straight I can get these lines. So if you're shouting at me through the screen to say it's not square, Claire, I know, that's okay for me, because I know that otherwise it'll just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller as I try and square it up. So I am going along the if it's good enough for me, then it's good enough, because I know that I'm fussier than the majority of people are, and then I cut myself some grace. So I hope you feel that you can do the same. It's not a get out clause by any way, stretch of the imagination. And if you can get yours absolutely perfect, then and are happy to strive to do so, then please do. Just for me, I just know that I need to be a little kind to myself, really. After all the work we've put into it, the last thing I want to do is unhappy with it. Now I am just going to turn this corner because one of my threads was a little bit short, but I'm just going to do a double stitch on the end of that corner, and then I'm going to change direction just so that I'm not pulling from one to the other. I'm taking that corner in, and then I'll just do a double stitch just over the top of where I was, just to hold that in place. As I say, it's just a tacking stitch, it's just to hold it in place. So that's where we are at the moment. We've got our quilt all nicely laid down onto our backing panel, and if we turn it over, you can hopefully see my stitches where I've just quilted that on. So it's just a big stitch, and if I just smooth my hands across the back of it, there's no ruckles up towards those gathering stitches at all where there's excess fabric. So that should all stand in, or a little bit maybe just there, that should all stand in good stead, but over the scheme of things I'm happy with that. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do now is I am going to trim this down now back to the 1/4 inch that we did on the sides here, and that's what is going to do next. So let's put the ruler back onto the edge here, find our 1/4 inch on our white edging strip. Now I find it a little bit more difficult to pull it straight, I think, at this stage, because each layer we add will make it more robust. But just do the best you can. One side done. You can see just a little bit there, it's just gone over slightly, but I'm not going to worry about that because that will bend in to my quilt when I've finished. Pull it up onto my mat. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. All I'm doing, pull it a bit closer so you can see hopefully, is I'm just lining up the 1/4 inch line on my ruler, and you can see how much it goes off at this corner. It's quite a lot off there, so we're just going to adjust for that if we can, but kind of let's take it most of the way up first. Most of the way we're okay, and it just seems to veer off in this corner, so I'm just going to start and try and even that out a little bit. Just a constant perfecting episode, isn't it, really? I know that I'm probably making this panel seem like a lot of work, and it isn't. It isn't. Work is a variable term, isn't it, really? Because what's work to some is pleasure to another. So again, you're trying to work within where you're still making it an enjoyable project to do. Without giving yourself too much of a headache, because sewing shouldn't be a headache, it should be fun. So last side here, and each time we're adding just structure to this quilt as well. You'll be surprised how stiff and robust it is once it's finished. There we go. Okay, so now make sure my rotary cutter is closed. Now we have our panel again, but this time we now have our nice neat backing on the back here. So we've got a few threads, but that's okay. So the next stage now, Hold on a second, let me change the camera angle so I can talk to you. So the next stage now is that we're going to now look at putting the dowelling on. Because dowelling is this, sorry there's noises outside, is this, it's a wooden flexible, or semi-flexible strip. I got this from my local DIY shop. I think it was only about £1.50, it's not a lot of money. And I've actually got two of these, so I wasn't sure when I bought them whether or not I'll be able to get two out of it, and I think I will be able to get just split it in half and get two. Because what this is going to do, so this has got some rigidity to it, as you can see, it's not very easily bendable. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a sleeve that fits on the back of this quilt and that will hold this dowel. Because if we hang it normally and we hang it by the corners, because of just the pressure of hanging it, it's going to fold in the middle like that. No matter what you try and do with it, it will fold. So by fitting a sleeve and putting the dowel in on the back here, it will actually hold the quilt rigid for us, so that when we are displaying it, and I'm going to do on top and bottom, you can just do top if you want to, it's up to you, whatever you prefer. You definitely need to do top, but bottom is optional. Yeah, bottom is optional because that'll hang straight anyway, pretty much. But I'm going to do top and bottom on mine, because when we store this, we'll be able to roll it up like this, and the dowels, and then we can tie it with a ribbon, and then it can be just stored like that with the Christmas decorations for each year. So first job is to decide how long you want your dowel, and I want mine pretty long. I'm going to probably cut this in half to start off with, but it needs to at least run the back of your quilt. Now this quilt is not going to reduce in size anymore now, because the binding will just go over these cut edges. So this is your final width and your final length of your quilt. But we do need just to put that sleeve in, and the sleeve can finish a little bit shorter than the actual quilt itself, because with the binding goes over the edge of here on a quilt. I don't know if you've ever done that. If you've not, you might not have seen that. But the binding actually is sewn I sew it onto the front first with my machine, and then I fold it over to the back, tuck it under, and then I hand sew it down. Can machine it if you want to. So we're going to lose probably about 1/4 of an inch each side of the length, because we can't sew through the dowelling, so we need to allow to be able to slot that in once we've put the binding on. Keep watching the video, it's all going to make sense, I promise. So we need a strip of fabric, and I think I might actually be able to use one of my offcuts. That's a little bit tight, so maybe not. No, I won't be able to use my offcuts. Oops, but that's fine. We want a strip of fabric that is going to be able to go round this dowelling and give us a little bit to hang on to. So all we do to measure that is, if you just take your dowelling, whatever thickness you get, this one's a round one, and then you want it to go around the dowelling post, you see there, and then just give yourself a little bit to be able to sew with. So we want at least 1/4 of an inch, but mine's about there. So if I pinch that there, I can then get a tape measure, and you've never got one when you want one, so hold on a second. I'm back. So I've got a seam gauge here, and I'm just going to measure what that is. And it's just over 1.5 inches. So I'm going to go to 1 3/4 just to give me a little bit of extra room. So my dowelling sleeves are going to be 1 3/4 inches, and they need to be approximately the width, well, they need to be the width of the quilt, because what we're going to do as well is we're going to turn in the ends twice to give ourselves a nice edge, and then once the dowelling's in, I'm just going to hand stitch that closed so that enclases the dowelling strip. So 1 3/4 inches times whatever the top edge of your quilt is. So that's what I want you to cut next, if that's okay, is your dowelling sleeves. And I'm going to cut 2 of those, because I'm going to put a dowelling sleeve top and bottom. So let's get on with doing that. Oops, things are falling off the edge of my works. It doesn't matter how much we've got to work with, does it? We always need more. So let's put the fabric down on my cutting mat. This is why I've worked out here, because I've got a little bit more room to work with. Can you see that? No, you can't. Let me move across. Oh, I'll tilt the camera, hold on. Okay, so camera tilted. So again, I've just put my fabric down onto my cutting mat. I'm going to now line it up with one of the lines on my cutting mat to make sure it's straight. We know that the width of this here goes across, and we're not on a selvage edge. If you're on a selvage edge, which is this bound bit here that you can see, there's often dots in it as well, don't use that for your turning under, because sometimes that can feel a bit different. So you'll take that bit off if you're using that edge. I'm not using my selvage edge, so I know that's all good. If I turn this over, you'll be able to see a little bit better, won't you? So I'm putting my panel on top of my fabric, and I'm just going to note that I need to go to that square just there. So let me just put my dowelling across there just for a second to remind me. If I can get my ruler. And now I want to 1 3/4 inches. Now again, if you haven't got a quilting ruler, just use a pen and just go along with the ruler. Just mark it in, so use your seam gauge and have a pen, mark it across and just do your little mark on the edge, and that's all that you need to do. All the way down, and then you can cut it with scissors. And I'm going to take this up to that dowelling and make sure this is as straight as it can be. 1 3/4 inches all the way up. Use my rotary cutter, take my time, and I can move that out the way now because I know that my ruler is at the edge, and I'll cut it off and that'll tell me where I'm ending. So there's my first little sleeve. Not miss the end of it. So that's my first little sleeve. So let's do the next one. So again, we want 1 3/4 inches, and this is just going to give you a bit of room. If you make it too tight, you're going to struggle to feed your doweling into the sleeve. Ask me how I know. And after you've sewn it all in, the last thing you want is to find that out at that stage, because then you've got a lot of unpicking to do. There we go. Still just caught slightly. And again, if you notice, I'm putting my ruler over the fabric I want to be cutting and saving. So that gives us our 2 strips now. And these are going to fit here at the top and bottom. And because we've got that little bit, by the time we've turned under at each end to neaten that off, so we're going to turn it under probably 1/4 inch and under at 1/4 inch. And then if we turn this side as well, under and under, to give us a nice edge. Then when I put this back up to the quilt again, you'll see it's just going to be out just slightly shorter than the actual quilt is. Let me just turn that round that way. You probably see better with that way round, can't you? So if you look, we're just a bit shy that edge, and we're just a bit shy that edge, and that's what I want, because I want to be able to feed the doweling in, but be out of the way of the binding. So that's our first 2 strips that we're going to put to one side and keep straight and precious. The next thing we're going to do then is we are going to be doing our strips for the binding itself. Now I normally bind at 2.5 or 2 1/4. I'm going to bind at 2 1/4 inches because you need 1/4 to go down, 1/4 to overlap that, then 1/4 for the edge, and then go under because of the folds. So I'm going to do my binding at 2 1/4 inches, and I need enough to go round all 4 sides of the quilt. So this is why I was happy to leave this nice long edge, because that nice long edge, if I just hold it up against my panel here, excluding the selvage, we don't want to use the selvage, if I take that up to there, and then take that across. So 1 strip along that length is going to be just shy of doing 2 sides of my quilt. So I need 2 and a bit edges on here. 2 and a bit edges, that doesn't make sense. 2 and a bit lengths, that's what I wanted to say. So I'm going to fold that long edge together. I'm going to put it this way, so that I'm working the right side. It feels strange because I always want to put my fabric that way, but it's not, it doesn't work that way. Take our ruler, and if we match our lines up on our quilting mat, if you've got one, you can do, and then line this up, we're going to cut a straight edge first. Now, there's two kinds of binding. There's bias binding and there's straight of grain. Now, because this is round a square item, we can just do it as a straight of grain binding. So we do it either in line with the selvage, or we do it at a 90-degree angle to the selvage when we're cutting it out. If we cut it at 45 degrees, you know, if you've looked on my skill builders, I think, or my other ones, I've spoken about having a quilt where it's got a stretch in it. We don't need a stretch, so we don't need to cut this binding on the bias. So it is just straight of grain binding. And I'm just going to neaten this edge up first. Take this little strip off so it gives us something nice to work with. So that comes off there. It's just a small bit, because see how it varies, just neatens it up. And then I'm going to turn the whole mat round to keep this straight, because the next thing we want to do is we want to then cut our strips off, and I want 2¼ inches. Let me turn my ruler around as well, because that's what we're doing now. So 2¼ inches, because I want it to be a nice tight binding. I don't want it to be too loose, but if I just do it at 2, I think it might be a bit small. So I'm going to do 2 strips off this length here. So that's one length. And then, so that I don't distort my fabric again, I'm going to move across to 4½, because 2¼ times 2 is 4½. And that means I cut the 2 strips out without moving my fabric. Okay. So here's the 2 binding strips we know that we need, and we need a little short one as well. So rather than use a whole strip here, I'm going to just use this little bit here. I think that should be enough. 2¼ This is actually quite straight, so I'm just going to work with that. Just double check my measurements before we cut again. Yes, 2¼ okay, and that should then be okay then for joining that together, and I'll show you how to join the binding in a second. Before we put this fabric away, the other thing that I want to do is I want to cut out 2 strips, because we want to make the hanging handle for going across the top, and that we're going to tie in a bow. And they tend to be longer than you realise, because you need to span across from the diagonal to a meeting point, and then it needs to tie in a bow and have some tails. So I'm actually going to cut 2 strips off this again, and I think that I want my strip for my rail, for my handle. Again, I think this is part of the trouble, but there's so many decisions to make. You know, how wide do you want your binding? How wide do you want your bow? Yeah, it's just tricky, isn't it, sometimes? So I think that what I'm going to do is, again, you can mock, you know, sort of mock it out with your fabric. I want to have my strips about that wide, but I want them to be 2-sided, and then I need the seam allowance on there, so another ½ inch for seam allowance. So let me just measure that, see where that is. And that's worked quite well for me, just folding it out. So 2½ inches I'm going to use for my ties. So if you like the look of my ties when you finish, then I've cut those at 2½ inches. So I'm just going back again to the end of my fabric, make sure it's all nice and straight. Got both edges on top of each other, they weren't quite. Just use your fingernails and it'll just smooth that fabric across for us. For you, for me, for everybody. And then 2½. I'm going to do 2 of these. So again, 1 at 2½, oops. Fabric together. And 1 at 5. And that will give us the 2 strips at 2½ inches long. And obviously I've got my fabric folded in half, so that's double at the moment. Okay, so we've got 2¼ for the binding, we've got 2½ for the bow, and I'm just going to fold these over like this so that I know that that's for my strips for my bow. So this is what we've got left out of our metre of fabric, which is great for going into our stash, because we've finished now cutting all the fabrics that we needed. So I know that might have seemed a little bit complicated for you, but it's because I'll put some notes in on the bottom for you as to what I've used, so that you can then hopefully crib onto that if you want to, if you like the finished effect of mine. So I'm just going to get tidied up, here, and then I'm going to move to my sewing room and we'll start and put this all together.